At 5:04 every morning, before the city remembered how to breathe, one woman was already awake, sorting cans with the precision of someone still doing the work she trained her whole life for, even though the world had told her that work no longer belonged to her. A billionaire watched her from across the sidewalk, certain he was looking at defeat. He was wrong. He was looking at the most disciplined mind he would ever meet, and in 20 minutes a torn backpack would prove it. Christian Davies was 48 years old, and he had not fully slept in 8. Not because Davies Global Holdings, a commercial real estate and logistics empire worth $9.3 billion, with towers in 11 cities, didn't run itself by now. It did. He built it that way on purpose. Machines that didn't need him to sleep. He slept 3 hours a night because his penthouse on the 52nd floor was quiet in a way that had a texture to it, a weight, and the only cure he'd found was to leave before the quiet could finish saying what it always said. So he arrived at the office by 4:50 every morning. Rain or otherwise. He told himself it was discipline. It was grief wearing a suit. 8 years earlier, Christian had lost his wife and their unborn son in a single moment on a stretch of interstate that took 11 minutes for an ambulance to reach. 11 minutes, because the nearest hospital had rerouted around construction and nobody had updated the emergency dispatch maps. 11 minutes he had spent since trying to buy back with every dollar he made. He funded hospital wings. He donated fleets of ambulances. None of it moved the needle on the number that actually mattered, which was 0, the number of nights it gave him back with her. So he did the only thing that had ever made the 8 quiet down. He worked. He told himself, the way successful men tell themselves things, compassion is expensive, and staying ahead is free. He believed it the way you believe a bruise will fade, not because you've tested it but because you need it to be true. He'd noticed the woman 3 mornings running now. Not because homeless men and women collecting cans outside a downtown tower was rare. Chicago had thousands of people surviving exactly this way, and the city had long since learned to walk past them without seeing them. Christian had walked past them too. That was the quiet shame he never said out loud. But this woman was different, and it had taken him 3 mornings to admit why. She didn't move like someone surviving. She moved like someone working. She separated the cans by brand before she bagged them. She recorded something in a small spiral notebook after every dumpster. Figures, Christian guessed, though from this distance he couldn't tell what she was measuring. She followed a route down the block that seemed almost surveyed, like she'd mapped which bins filled fastest and when. Her gloves were worn through at the knuckles. Her glasses were spotless. She didn't carry a sign. She carried a black backpack stuffed so full its zipper strained, and this morning the zipper had finally lost. Christian was already moving before he decided to. He crouched, gathering scattered papers before the rain could ruin them further, and that was when he saw it. Beneath a folded rain jacket, the thesis. Beside it, loose in a plastic sleeve, what looked like an environmental engineering certificate. A conference badge with her photo on it, laminated, 3 years old, reading Carrie Daniels, panel speaker. She snatched the papers back with a speed that told him this had happened before, people getting too close, seeing too much. Her eyes, when they finally met his, weren't afraid. They were furious, and underneath the fury, exhausted. "I don't need help," she said. Not defensive. Just final, the way people say things they've had to say 100 times. "I wasn't offering any," Christian said, which was almost true. She zipped what she could of the bag, gathered the rest into her arms and walked. Not ran, walked, with the same deliberate precision she used to sort cans, like running would mean admitting something had actually rattled her. Christian stood under the awning long after she disappeared around the corner, rain soaking through his coat, holding one piece of paper she hadn't managed to grab in time. A single page from the thesis. A case study, it looked like, on emergency infrastructure failures in urban housing. He didn't read it yet. He couldn't. His hands weren't steady enough. He rode the elevator to the 52nd floor in silence, and for the first time in 8 years, work did not quiet the noise in his head. If anything, it got louder, circling one impossible question. Why does a woman with a master's degree collect cans for a living, and what is she really studying out there? He had no idea, standing in that elevator, that the page in his hand was about to answer a question he'd stopped letting himself ask. By 9 that morning, Christian had a name, a face, and a silence where a career should have been. He hadn't planned to investigate her. He told himself, riding down to his corner office, that he'd hand the loose page to security and forget it. But the page sat on his desk through 2 board calls and a site acquisition review, and by the 3rd meeting he'd stopped pretending he was going to let it go. He called Marcus Feld, who ran discreet research for the company's due diligence team, and gave him one instruction: Carrie Daniels. Find out who she was before she was on my sidewalk. The file came back by noon, and it did not read like the biography of someone who ends up sorting recycling outside a stranger's office tower. Carrie Daniels, 38. Master's degree in urban and environmental planning, top of her cohort. Specialization: sustainable waste infrastructure and smart city recycling systems. 2 published papers in peer-reviewed environmental journals. A keynote slot at a national urban planning conference. Christian recognized the hotel ballroom in the photo, had been to conferences in that same room himself. Consulting work for a firm called Green Earth Infrastructure, cited in 3 separate city planning proposals. Then, 3 years ago, the file went quiet. Not slowed down, quiet the way a signal cuts rather than fades. No employment records. No published work. A civil lawsuit, settled, sealed. A foreclosure notice on a house in her father's name. And then nothing official at all, just a gap where a career should have kept climbing, filled instead with 2 words from a shelter intake form Marcus had somehow gotten his hands on: unemployed, unhoused. Christian read it twice, then a 3rd time, looking for the part that explained it. It wasn't there. He thought about the way she'd sorted those cans. Scientific. Deliberate. A woman with nowhere to sleep who still, evidently, could not stop being a researcher. How does someone fall this far and keep working like this anyway? He went looking for her that evening, telling himself it was simple curiosity, knowing it wasn't. He checked the block outside his tower first, then the shelter 2 miles east that Marcus's file had flagged. A volunteer at the intake desk confirmed to Carrie Daniels had stayed there, on and off, for the better part of a year. Quiet. Kept to herself. Always had a notebook. She's not here tonight, the volunteer said, checking a clipboard. She doesn't always come when it's not freezing. Christian left his card, which the volunteer looked at like it belonged to a different species of person than the ones who usually left cards there. He didn't expect it to reach her. He was starting to understand that Carrie Daniels was someone who had gotten very good at not being reached. He came back the next morning at 4:50, same as always, and there she was, same corner, same precision, gloves worn at the same knuckles. She'd retaped the zipper on the backpack with electrical tape. This time, when she saw him watching from the curb, she didn't wait for him to approach. She simply gathered her bags a beat faster than usual and moved down the block, taking a different route than the one she'd used the 2 mornings before. She changed her pattern. Because of him. Christian stood there a long moment, understanding 2 things at once. The first was that whatever had happened to Carrie Daniels, it had taught her that being noticed by powerful men rarely ended well for her. The second was that he had just become, in her eyes, exactly the kind of man she'd learned to disappear from. He went upstairs and read the loose page from her thesis for the first time, really read it, not skimmed it. It was a case study on emergency access failures in multi-unit housing, response time data, infrastructure gaps, policy recommendations written in a voice that was precise without being cold, urgent without being dramatic. The kind of writing that came from someone who had done the research because it mattered, not because a grade depended on it. He didn't know yet what the rest of the thesis contained. He didn't know that buried further inside it was a case study that would stop his heart entirely. He only knew, closing the file, that a woman who wrote like this did not belong on a sidewalk sorting cans at 5 in the morning, and that whatever had put her there, it hadn't been a lack of brilliance. It had been something done to her. He thought about calling Marcus back, asking him to dig further into the sealed lawsuit, and stopped himself. Not because he didn't want the answer. He wanted it badly, in the same restless way he wanted every unresolved variable in his life resolved by morning, but because something about the way Carrie had zipped that backpack shut, the way she'd said "I don't need help" like a door closing, told him that whatever this woman had survived, she had not survived it to become someone's charity case, or someone's mystery to be solved for entertainment. He sat with that thought longer than he expected to. In 9 years of building an empire, Christian had learned to treat every unknown as a problem to be acquired, audited, and closed out. Carrie Daniels did not fit that pattern, and some quiet, unfamiliar part of him understood, even that first week, that if he tried to force her to fit it, he would lose whatever chance he had of actually understanding her. So he did the only other thing he knew how to do. He kept reading. He kept the loose page from her thesis on his desk, not in a drawer, and every time he passed it he let himself ask the question again, a little more honestly each time. Not what happened to her, but what is she still trying to save out there on that sidewalk, that she hasn't let herself give up on? 3 years earlier, Carrie Daniels had believed, the way you believe things you've never had reason to doubt, that doing good work honestly was enough to keep you safe. She'd been a senior analyst at Green Earth Infrastructure for 4 years by then, the youngest person in the building with her title, the one partners requested by name when a city contract needed someone who actually understood the data instead of just presenting it. She had a corner desk with a window. She had her father, Walter, 2 bus stops away, proud in the quiet way men of his generation were proud, keeping a printed copy of her first published paper in his kitchen drawer like a certificate. Then she found the invoices. It started as a discrepancy so small she almost let it go. A waste hauling contractor billing the city for tonnage that didn't match the landfill's intake logs. She pulled the numbers because that was simply what she did, the same instinct that made her double-check every recycling bin now. What she found, 3 weeks and one very careful spreadsheet later, was a scheme running through 4 contracts and 2 shell companies. Illegal dumping, falsified environmental compliance reports, and a partner at her own firm who had signed off on all of it for a percentage. She had 2 choices, and she has replayed both of them more times than she can count since. She could file it quietly and let someone above her decide what to do with it. Or she could do what she actually did, which was take it to the city's Environmental Oversight Board herself. Because 6 months earlier she had stood in a neighborhood built on top of one of those illegal dump sites and watched a mother tell her that her son's asthma had started the year the trucks began coming at night. The board opened an investigation. Green Earth Infrastructure did not survive it clean, and neither, in the end, did Carrie. The firm's lawyers moved faster than the truth could. They built a case that Carrie herself had falsified expense reports. A claim built on nothing but timing and money, and enough of both to make a headline. She was never charged with anything a court would uphold. She didn't need to be. The lawsuit alone was enough to make every firm in her field quietly stop returning her calls. Blacklisted isn't a word anyone uses out loud in her industry. It's just a silence that follows you from interview to interview until you stop scheduling them. The legal fees came first. Then her father's diagnosis, a heart condition that needed monitoring he could no longer afford without her income. Then the house, the one he'd owned outright for 11 years, gone to a bank because Carrie had put it up as collateral for a legal defense that couldn't save either of them. Walter Daniels died 18 months later, in a rented room 2 miles from the corner desk with the window his daughter used to have. Carrie has never told anyone, not the shelter volunteers, not the outreach counselors, that the last thing she promised him was that she would finish the research. That whatever happened to her career, the work itself would not die with the house or the lawsuit or him. So she kept working. Not for a paycheck because there wasn't one, and not for a firm because none would touch her. She kept working because a city's waste patterns don't stop generating data just because the woman studying them lost her office. She mapped collection routes on foot now instead of from a desk. She recorded density and timing in a spiral notebook instead of a database. It was slower, and it was humiliating in ways she had stopped letting herself feel most days, but it was still the work, and the work was the only promise she had left to keep. What Carrie didn't know, what she had no possible way of knowing, kneeling on a sidewalk with a torn backpack in front of a stranger in a wool coat, was that the evidence clearing her name had never actually disappeared. It had simply been buried by people with more money than her, in a filing cabinet that a man with $9.3 billion and a research team was now, without fully understanding why he cared, in the process of digging up. Christian didn't know her story yet either. But by the end of that week he would know the details of Green Earth Infrastructure's collapse better than most of the people who'd worked there, and he would know, with the particular clarity that comes to men who've spent their whole lives assessing risk, that Carrie Daniels hadn't fallen because she failed at anything. She had fallen because she refused to lie. There was a version of Carrie's story where she took the quiet path, filed her findings anonymously, and kept the corner desk with the window. She thinks about that version sometimes, in the honest hours before dawn when the city is still asleep and there's no one to perform dignity for. She doesn't regret what she did. She has simply learned that regret and grief can occupy the same body without ever becoming the same thing, and most days that distinction is the only reason she gets up and puts her gloves on. What she has never stopped believing through the lawsuit and the foreclosure and her father's funeral and 18 months of sleeping in places that were never meant to be slept in, is that the work itself was never the mistake. The world had simply not been ready to reward a woman who told the truth about people with more money than her. She has read enough history to know she is not the first person that has happened to, and she has decided, in the privacy of her own mind, that she will not be bitter about being right. Christian tracked down a full copy of Carrie's thesis through the university archive 2 days later, paying a fee that would have embarrassed him if he'd let himself think about it, and reading it that same night in the one chair in his penthouse that still faced the window she used to look out of years ago. In a different life he no longer let himself remember out loud. The work was better than he'd expected, and he'd expected a great deal, because he had learned by then not to underestimate her. Chapter by chapter, it built a case for something Christian had spent 9 years and several $100 million trying to buy his way toward without ever fully articulating. Cities that didn't fail the people inside them when it mattered most. Waste systems that doubled as data networks for emergency planning. Recycling infrastructure redesigned not just for sustainability, but for access, for the version of a city where nobody died waiting 11 minutes for help that should have taken 4. He read past midnight. He read past 2. He told himself he was evaluating her as a potential hire, the way he evaluated everyone, and he almost believed it until he reached chapter 6. The chapter was titled Case Study, Preventable Loss, the Ashford Row Apartment Fire. Christian's hand went still on the page before his mind had caught up to why. Ashford Row. He knew that address the way you know the exact configuration of a scar you've had since childhood. Instantly, completely, without needing to look. 9 years ago, a fire had moved through a residential building on Ashford Row in under 20 minutes because the fire suppression system had been quietly decommissioned during a cost-cutting renovation, and because the nearest engine company had been rerouted that night around a street closure nobody had updated on the city's dispatch maps. 6 people died. One of them was Elena Davies, 26 years old, Christian's younger sister, who had been visiting a friend on the 4th floor and had called Christian 40 minutes before the fire started, laughing about something so small he could no longer remember what it was. He had spent 9 years funding safer buildings, smarter cities, better infrastructure. He had told himself, standing at ribbon cuttings for buildings named after donors who weren't him, that this was how you honored someone, quietly, financially, from a distance that never required you to actually feel anything. And here, in the handwriting of a woman he had watched sort cans outside his own office, was a 20-page analysis of exactly what had killed his sister. Dispatch failures, decommissioned systems, the precise chain of small bureaucratic negligences that had turned a 20-minute fire into a fatal one. Carrie had cited the incident not as a headline, but as the case that had, in her own footnote, crystallized the author's commitment to infrastructure that protects people who have no way of protecting themselves. She had never met Elena. She had no reason to know Christian existed when she wrote it. And somehow, 3 years before a torn backpack brought them onto the same sidewalk, she had already spent months of unpaid, uncredited research trying to make sure that what happened to his sister never happened to anyone else's. Christian sat with the thesis open on his lap for a long time after that, in an apartment that had never once, in 8 years, felt smaller than it did in that moment. He had believed, since he was a boy watching his mother's version of hard work fail to save her the way Carrie's father's illness had failed her too, that the world rewarded people according to how much they had, not what they'd done. He had built an empire on that belief. It had made him rich, and it had made him precise, and it had made him almost entirely alone. Carrie Daniels had lost everything a person can lose: her career, her home, her father, her name in an industry she loved. And she had still spent her nights, homeless, honoring a stranger's death with the same rigor she'd once brought to a corner office with a window. Without knowing it, she had been keeping the promise Christian had spent 9 years pretending money could keep for him. He closed the thesis somewhere near 4 in the morning and did something he had not done in longer than he wanted to admit. He sat in the dark of his own penthouse and let himself feel exactly how much he owed a woman who currently did not trust him enough to say 5 words to him on a sidewalk. Tomorrow, he thought, I am not going to offer her money. He didn't yet know what he was going to offer instead. But for the first time in 8 years, he had a reason to figure it out that had nothing to do with guilt, and everything to do with the fact that Carrie Daniels was, by every measure that had ever mattered to him, exactly the kind of brilliant he had spent his whole life pretending he only wanted from other people. He thought, too, about how close he had come to walking past her entirely that first morning. How many mornings in the 8 years before this one, he must have walked past someone exactly like her without ever once slowing down. The thought did not comfort him. It sat in his chest the rest of the night like a debt he had only just discovered he owed, not only to Carrie, but to every version of her the city had already lost before he'd learned to look. Christian found her 2 mornings later, 3 blocks further down than her usual corner, and he made the mistake, the very expensive, very unfamiliar mistake, of leading with money. I read your thesis, he said, which was true and which he'd meant as a way in. Carrie's hands stopped moving over the cans for exactly 1 second before they resumed, faster now. You had no right to that. I had a page you left on the sidewalk and a university archive fee. I'm not apologizing for reading brilliant work. I'm not interested in being someone's redemption project. She zipped the bag, new bag he noticed, sturdier than the last one, and he wondered with a small, unpleasant twist whether she'd spent money she didn't have to replace it because of him. I've met men like you before. You feel guilty about something and I happen to be standing where the guilt can reach me. That's not. I don't need charity. She was already moving, and Christian, who had negotiated 9-figure acquisitions without raising his voice, found himself half a step behind a woman in a worn green jacket, entirely unable to find the sentence that would make her stop. I wasn't going to offer charity, he said to her back. I was going to offer you a job. She stopped then. Didn't turn around right away, which told him more than her face would have. A job, she repeated flat, like she was testing the word for the trap inside it. A real one. Interview, presentation, the whole process. No special treatment. You'd have to earn it against people who don't know your name and won't care about your story. And if I don't want it? Then I'll have wasted a morning, Christian said, which, believe me, would not be the worst investment I've made this year. She turned around at that, not warm, not yet, but something in her had shifted a degree the way ice shifts before it decides whether to crack or hold. Why? He almost told her about Elena. Almost said her sister's name in the case study in the 9 years, and something in him, old instinct, the same one that had kept him upright through 8 years of grief without letting anyone see the cost of it, pulled the words back before they reached his mouth. Not yet. Not like this on a sidewalk as a bargaining chip to make her trust him faster. Because your work is good, he said instead, which was also entirely true. And because I think this city and my company would be worse off for not having it. She studied him for a long moment, rain starting again somewhere above them, and Christian understood, watching her decide, that trust was not something his money could purchase from her the way it purchased almost everything else in his life. It had to be earned in a currency he'd let atrophy for 8 years. Patience and proof and the willingness to be told no. She told him no. I'll think about it, she said, which from anyone else would have meant something hopeful, and from Carrie Daniels, watching her already walking away, meant something closer to leave me alone before I have to trust you and get hurt again. By the next morning her corner was empty. The one after that empty again. Christian sent Marcus back out to check the shelter. She hadn't been in for 3 nights. He checked 2 other corners further down the route her notebook patterns suggested she might favor. Nothing. She had disappeared, deliberately and completely, the way a woman disappears when she has spent 3 years teaching herself exactly how. What Christian didn't know yet, what would only become clear in the boardroom battle still weeks away, was that Carrie's silence wasn't only about him. 2 former colleagues from Green Earth Infrastructure, the same men whose falsified reports had ended her career, had heard through industry backchannels that a Davies Global researcher was asking questions about the old lawsuit. Men who'd buried a scandal once were not eager to have it dug back up by a billionaire with resources they couldn't match, and word was already moving through certain law offices that Carrie Daniels needed to stay exactly as invisible as she'd been for the last 3 years. Christian stood at the empty corner on the fourth morning, coffee going cold in his hand, understanding for the first time that money had gotten him further in every part of his life except the one part that was starting to matter the most. He was going to have to build something worth trusting, and he was going to have to do it without being able to find her to explain why. He went back to that corner every morning for the next week anyway, not because he expected her to be there, but because it had become, without his fully choosing it, the only part of his day that felt like it was pointed at something other than the next acquisition. He stood under the same awning, coffee going cold, and thought about how strange it was that a woman who wanted nothing from him had somehow become the first person in 8 years he actually wanted to prove himself to. It occurred to him, standing there on the sixth empty morning, that he had spent 9 years building an empire designed to make people need him. Carrie Daniels was the first person he had met in all that time who didn't, and he was only beginning to understand that this was exactly why he couldn't stop thinking about her. Christian's card reached her 12 days later, not through him, but through the same shelter volunteer who'd taken it the first time, passed along, she told Carrie, because the sustainability job posting downtown's been all over the community boards, and something told me you'd want to see it before someone else got the idea. The Davies Sustainability Initiative posting hadn't mentioned Christian by name and hadn't been written to attract her specifically, which was, Carrie realized reading it twice on a library computer, exactly why she trusted it enough to apply. He hadn't built her a door. He'd built a door and left it unlocked for anyone qualified enough to walk through, and trusted that she was. She showed up to the interview in the only blazer she owned that still fit, borrowed from a shelter clothing closet, with a printed copy of the thesis under her arm like armor. The boardroom held 6 people, none of whom Christian had personally briefed, because he'd made that decision the moment he heard she'd applied. If Carrie Daniels earned this, it would not be because he'd tipped the scales. Victor Crane, the division's incoming CFO, opened with the question Carrie had been asked in every interview for 3 years. The polite, procedural way of asking why is there a 3-year gap on your resume without saying it directly. Because I was blacklisted for reporting fraud, Carrie said, no hedge in it, no apology. And because I spent those 3 years doing the research anyway without a salary, without an office, and without anyone paying attention. I'd encourage you to read the case studies before you decide whether that gap disqualifies me. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone has said something true that nobody in the room was prepared for. She presented for 40 minutes after that, and Christian, sitting at the far end of the table specifically so no one could accuse him of steering the room, watched Carrie Daniels become, in real time, exactly the person her thesis had promised she was. She walked them through waste density modeling that could cut collection costs by nearly a third. She showed how recycling infrastructure, redesigned properly, could double as an early warning network for aging emergency systems. The same idea, Christian realized with a chill he didn't let show on his face, that lived at the center of the Ashford Row case study she had no idea he'd read. Victor Crane, who had walked in prepared to be unimpressed, asked the hardest question of the day near the end. This is ambitious work for someone with no corporate infrastructure behind her for 3 years. How do we know you can execute this at scale, not just theorize it? You don't, Carrie said. Not from a resume. So let me show you the pilot data instead. She pulled out a folder Christian hadn't known she'd prepared, 6 months of hand-recorded observations from her own collection routes, cross-referenced against city sanitation logs she'd requested through public records while she had no address to put on the request form. I've been running this model, unfunded, on foot for 6 months. Here's what it already predicts correctly. Imagine what it does with a budget. Nobody in the room spoke for a full 10 seconds. Christian, watching from the far end of the table, felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 8 years. Not because he'd saved her, because he very deliberately hadn't, but because he was watching, in real time, the exact thing he'd stopped believing was possible. Proof that the world could still recognize brilliance in someone it had spent 3 years trying to erase. The vote, when Victor Crane called it, was unanimous. Carrie Daniels did not cry in the boardroom, though Christian suspected, watching her jaw tighten as she shook each hand, that it cost her something to hold it together until the door closed behind her. She found him afterward in the hallway, where he'd deliberately positioned himself to look like he just happened to be passing. "You didn't brief them," she said. "Not quite a question. I didn't need to. You did that yourself." She held his gaze a moment longer than she had on any of the mornings before. "Why does it matter to you this much? The truth, Christian. Not the version where you say my work is good." He almost told her, standing in that hallway 12 days closer to trusting her than he'd been on the sidewalk. He didn't, not yet. Some truths he was learning needed the right room, and a hallway outside a boardroom she just conquered on her own merit, wasn't it? "Soon," he said. "I promise you'll know soon." She nodded once, accepting the answer the way she seemed to accept most things now, not with full trust, but with a willingness to keep gathering evidence before she decided. It was, Christian thought, watching her walk toward the elevator with the same unhurried precision she'd once used to sort cans, exactly the way a good researcher should treat every claim, including his. He stayed in the hallway long after she'd gone, turning over the 12 days it had taken to get here. The sidewalk, the silence, the disappearance, the door he'd built and deliberately not walked her through. He had spent 9 years believing that the fastest path to any outcome was the one with the most resources behind it. Carrie Daniels had just spent 40 minutes proving, in front of 6 strangers who owed her nothing, that some outcomes only ever belong to the person who earns them, and that no amount of his money could have shortened that boardroom by a single sentence. The story broke 9 days after Carrie started, and it did not break the way Christian had hoped it eventually would. A financial blog with a history of running unverified corporate leaks published a piece alleging that Davies Global Holdings had hired a disgraced former analyst with a fraud lawsuit in her past to head a flagship sustainability division. The phrase fraud lawsuit doing exactly the work it was designed to do, which was imply guilt while never technically lying. Christian recognized the fingerprints before he'd finished the second paragraph. 2 names from the old Green Earth Infrastructure leadership, the same men whose falsified reports had built the case against Carrie 3 years ago, had resurfaced as unnamed industry sources familiar with the matter. "They're not trying to hurt me," Carrie said, standing in Christian's office with the article printed and shaking slightly in her hand. "They're trying to make sure the truth about the dumping contracts never gets attached to a platform big enough for anyone to notice. Then we give them a bigger platform than the one they're afraid of," Christian said. What followed was not a quiet legal settlement, which was what Victor Crane and the board's lawyers initially recommended. Christian, for the first time in longer than he could remember, chose differently than his instinct for protecting the company's image would have chosen 8 years earlier. He authorized Carrie's legal team, a real one this time funded properly, to reopen the original whistleblower case, not to protect Davies Global's reputation, but to finish what Carrie had started 3 years ago and been financially destroyed for trying. The original invoices Carrie had found, along with 3 years of additional documentation her old firm's lawyers hadn't known existed, went to the same city oversight board that had failed to protect her the first time, except this time, the filing came from a division of a $9 billion company, with a legal team the old firm couldn't outspend into silence. 2 public hearings followed within a month. Carrie testified at both, and Christian watched her do it with the same precision she'd once used to sort cans into piles most people wouldn't have thought to separate, patient, exact, immovable under cross-examination designed to rattle her. The corrupt contracts collapsed publicly this time, in full view of the press that had once been paid to bury them. Green Earth Infrastructure's former leadership, the 2 men who had spent 3 years believing they'd successfully erased a whistleblower, found their names in the same headlines they'd once used to end her career. Carrie's name was cleared, not quietly, not through a settlement with a confidentiality clause, but in open hearing records anyone could read. The financial blog that had run the smear piece issued a correction so thorough it read, Christian noted with something close to satisfaction, almost like an apology. Carrie found him in his office the night after the second hearing, still in the same blazer she'd worn to her interview, worn thin now at the elbows the way her gloves had once been. "You didn't have to fight that publicly," she said. "You could have settled it quietly and kept the company's name out of it." I could have, Christian agreed. I've spent 8 years choosing quiet over true when it came to things that mattered to me. I'm done making that particular trade. Carrie looked at him for a long moment, something in her face finally unguarded in a way it hadn't been since the morning her backpack tore open on a wet sidewalk. You still haven't told me why this mattered so much to you. The real reason. Christian reached into his desk drawer and set the loose thesis page, the one she'd left behind on the sidewalk 3 months ago, the one he'd never given back, on the desk between them. Beside it he placed the case study chapter. Ashford Rowe. Her handwriting, his sister's name, circled now in his own hand. Read the name you cited in chapter 6, he said quietly. Then I'll tell you everything. In the weeks between the first hearing and the second, Christian had watched something in Carrie's shift that had nothing to do with the lawsuit at all. She had stopped flinching, slightly, when reporters called her name in the hallway outside the hearing room. She had started answering questions from her own team without the careful, defensive precision she'd needed on the sidewalk, back when every stranger who noticed her was a potential threat. Vindication, he was learning, didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in small increments. A room that believed her the first time, a headline that used her name without a qualifier attached to it, a night where she slept without the old dream of foreclosure notices and empty bank accounts finding her anyway. He had watched all of it from a careful distance, telling himself he was simply supporting a colleague through a difficult public fight. It was only standing in his office that night, the thesis page and the case study side by side on the desk between them, that he let himself admit the distance had never really been about professionalism. It had been about fear, the particular fear of a man who had spent 9 years making sure nothing could be taken from him twice, discovering that he had already, without permission, let someone back in far enough to lose again. Carrie read the circled name for a long time before she looked up. Elena Davies, she said slowly. Your sister. My sister, Christian confirmed. 26. She was visiting a friend on the 4th floor of Ashford Row the night of the fire. She called me 40 minutes before it started, and I was in a meeting, and I let it go to voicemail because I thought there'd be a later. His voice didn't break exactly, but it thinned into something Carrie hadn't heard from him before. Not the voice of the man who'd offered her a job on a sidewalk, but the voice of the boy who'd been 14 when the world first taught him it didn't protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I've spent 9 years funding smarter cities because I couldn't save the one person the old ones failed. And 3 years ago, without ever meeting me, you wrote the most precise explanation I've ever read of exactly what killed her. And you did it because you refused to let her death, or anyone else's, be filed away as unavoidable. Carrie sat with that for a long moment, the office quiet around them in the particular way rooms go quiet when two separate griefs finally recognize each other. I dedicated that chapter to a case number, she said finally. I never knew there was a person's face behind it. I'm sorry, Christian. I'm so sorry it was her. Don't be, Christian said. You spent 3 years honoring her before you even knew her name. I spent 9 spending money instead of grieving. I think you did the harder, better thing. Neither of them said anything else that night that needed to be written down. Some conversations end not with more words, but with the decision to stop needing them. What came after, over the following year, needed fewer words and a great deal more work. Carrie's division reduced Davies Global's operational waste by 48% within 10 months, a number that made trade publications call her office for comment and made Victor Crane, who had once asked her the hardest question in that first boardroom, personally recommend her for the industry's top emerging leader award. The waste optimization system she'd once modeled with a notebook and public records requests filed while she had no address to put on the form were, within a year, saving the company over $22 million annually, money Christian redirected, at Carrie's quiet insistence, into a fund neither of them named after either of their families at first. They named it eventually, once Carrie stopped needing to be talked into believing she deserved to be honored the same way she'd honored a stranger's sister for 3 unpaid years. The Elena Davies Urban Innovation Foundation launched with a scholarship fund for graduate researchers in sustainable infrastructure, the kind of fund that would have changed the trajectory of Carrie's own career 3 years earlier if it had existed then. Carrie used part of her first real paycheck in 3 years to visit her father's grave, The modest plot 2 counties over that she'd paid off in installments the moment she had an income again. She stood there a long time in the cold, the way she used to stand at recycling bins at 5 a.m., patient and precise, and said the only sentence she'd promised herself she'd say the day the work finally paid off. "We made it, Dad." Christian changed too, in ways that showed up less in headlines and more in the small architecture of an ordinary week. Dinners that weren't working dinners, a Saturday morning that had nothing scheduled on it for the first time in 8 years, a penthouse that had started, slowly, to feel less like a quiet that had a texture and more like a place someone actually lived. He had spent 9 years believing that money was the only thing grief couldn't take from him. It took Carrie Daniels, a woman he'd once watched sort cans outside his own building, certain he was looking at defeat, to teach him that money had never been the thing keeping him upright at all. It had been the promise. Hers, kept in a notebook on a sidewalk. His, finally kept out loud. The foundation's launch event was small, deliberately so. No press, no gala, just a handful of city officials, a few of Carrie's old university mentors who had reached out once her name cleared, and Marcus Feld standing quietly near the back, the only person in the room who'd read Carrie's file before either of them knew what it would come to mean. Christian gave no speech that night beyond a single sentence, delivered to the room rather than to Carrie directly, because some things are easier to say to a crowd than to the one person they're actually for. "My sister spent her whole life believing cities could be built to take care of the people inside them," he said. It took someone the city had already stopped taking care of to prove her right. Carrie didn't cry that night either, though Christian noticed, watching her accept the framed foundation charter afterward, that she held it the exact way she used to hold her father's printed copy of her first published paper, like something too important to risk dropping, even for a second. 2 years after a backpack tour opened on a wet Chicago sidewalk, cities in 4 states had adopted versions of the waste-to-early warning infrastructure model Carrie Daniels had built, first with a notebook, then with a division, then with a foundation carrying a dead woman's name into a future she'd never gotten to see. Christian sat in on the city council briefing the day Chicago itself approved the pilot program at scale, the same city that had walked past Carrie for 3 years without seeing anything but a woman collecting cans. He watched her present to a room of officials who addressed her now as Director Daniels, and he thought, not for the first time, that the city owed her an apology it would never quite know how to give, and that she had never once asked for one. "You could have told them," Christian said afterward, walking with her out of City Hall into an evening that had, for once, no rain in it, "about what they missed. What they let happen to you." "I thought about it," Carrie admitted. "But I decided a while ago that being right about what they did to me matters less than making sure it doesn't happen to the next person. That's a better use of the time I have left to be angry about it." Christian, who had spent 9 years turning grief into buildings because he didn't know a better way to spend it, understood that sentence the way he understood very few things anymore without her help. They stood outside Davies Global Tower the next morning at 5:04. The exact time, Christian realized only after they'd both arrived, that had started all of it. The corner where the recycling bins used to sit had been redesigned 18 months earlier, part of the first pilot Carrie had run on the building itself. Smart sorting stations that fed data into the same early warning network her thesis had first proposed, back when she had nowhere to sleep and nothing but a notebook to prove she still mattered. Carrie arrived not with bags of cans this time, but with a tablet under her arm, plans for the next phase of the rollout loaded and ready, the same worn-through gloves. She'd kept them, Christian had noticed, the one artifact of those 3 years she refused to let go of. "Ready?" she asked, nodding toward the doors. Christian thought about the first morning, watching a stranger he'd assumed was defeated, working with a precision he hadn't yet understood was brilliance. He thought about the sister he'd spent 9 years trying to honor with money, before a homeless woman with a torn backpack taught him that honoring someone actually required showing up, in the smaller and harder ways money can't buy. "I used to believe," he said, "that money was the only thing this city respected. And now I think the city just needed someone patient enough to make it look twice." They walked in together as the building woke up around them, past the corner where a torn backpack had once spilled a stranger's whole future onto wet concrete, and neither of them looked back at it, because they had both spent long enough looking backward. Somewhere in that tower's foundation now sat a system built from a homeless woman's overlooked genius and a grieving man's overdue humility, proof, in steel and data and a scholarship fund carrying his sister's name, that the city had walked past Carrie Daniels thousands of times without ever truly seeing her. It took one man who had everything to finally understand that the world's greatest treasures are usually hiding in exactly the places everyone else has already learned to look away from. Later that year, a journalist writing a retrospective on the Foundation's first 12 months asked Carrie what she would say to the version of herself who had been kneeling on that sidewalk, backpack torn open, certain the last of her dignity had just spilled onto wet concrete in front of a stranger. Carrie thought about it longer than the journalist expected. "I'd tell her the notebook mattered," she finally said. "Even when nobody was reading it. Even when it felt like proof of nothing but a life that had fallen apart. I'd tell her to keep writing it down anyway, because someday someone is going to need exactly the thing you refuse to stop studying, and you won't know which morning that someone walks by until it already has." Christian, reading the printed interview months later at his desk, understood that sentence better than any balance sheet he'd ever reviewed. He kept the clipping in the same drawer where the torn thesis page still lived, filed now beside a photograph of Elena, the two pieces of paper that had, between them, rebuilt the only kind of empire he still cared about proving he could build. If this story stayed with you, you know exactly which person in your life deserves a second look before you walk past them tomorrow morning. Follow for the next story, because the next Carrie Daniels is out there right now, and someone needs to be the one who doesn't look away.